Wanna talk? So let's talk. Here. Talk. You wanna talk? You gotta talk, you need to talk. News talk.
I talk, you talk to Solomon. I talk, you talk to Solomon. Yeah, let's talk to Solomon. Talk to Solomon.
You gotta talk, you wanna talk.
Talk to Solomon here. Stan Solomon is the host.
Chief Steve is the in-studio co-host.
And the guest of honor is our friend, Dr. Alan Keyes. Alan, I want you to explain to me why a funny thing happened on the way to the sky falling. For 18 years, the temperatures haven't gone up. In fact, they've gone down. The models of the global warming side say they should have gone up a noticeable amount. The claim is that human beings cause the planet to heat, and that since we have not fewer but more human beings, we have not fewer but more cars, we have not fewer but more emissions. Why is it that global warming isn't happening? Well, could it be that human activity has not, does not, and will not affect the temperature of this world any more than my spraying a can of starch on my shirt will or won't affect the ozone layer?
Well, Stan, I think one of the problems all along with the claims that were being made for global so-called warming, or as they used to say, the UN, global climatological change. That, by the way, is an interesting phrase, global climatological change, because if you think it through, it means the weather changes. And since the weather changes, therefore, we have to take all this power away from you people, so you can't govern yourselves or live in freedom. That's a very interesting trick if they can get away with it. And they tried to get away with it, Stan, by falsifying their scientific data, by making these studies that turned out to contain within them all kinds of flaws, and by silencing it when they could anybody who raised a question about it, trying to laugh them out of the room and so forth and so on. So what I have concluded over time, Stan, is that this whole business with global warming and global climatological change and all of this other stuff, it reminds me of what I understand was done by the high priests in some of the old civilizations, where in ancient Babylon and places like this, they started to get some knowledge about things like eclipses, right? Now, if you knew that the eclipse was coming and you could calculate how long it was likely to last of the sun or the moon, then you could start telling people that it was or was not going to happen because of something they did. And if they would only do what you told them to do, maybe you would tell them to bring all their golden goods to you so you could melt them down and build a nice idol and so forth and so on, or bring their extra food to you, or maybe just give you the power to decide how the land was going to be parceled out and so forth. Now, that manipulation of superstition is a great political trick. It's fascinating that in our time, Stan, where people think of themselves as so sophisticated and knowledgeable and science has changed everything, and yet in point of fact, the whole global warming business represents a new form of the manipulation of superstition. And only this time, the information doesn't even have to be accurate. So you can tell them that the sun's going to be eclipsed, and then when it's not eclipsed, you can tell them, well, it's still your fault. And they get away with it. This might lead you to conclude, Stan, that people in this scientific era, when we pride ourselves on being much smarter than anybody who ever lived in the world before, that we actually turn out to be more gullible fools and idiots than people ever were before in human history. It should give us pause. It should also, I think, Stan, in terms of the pride that we want to take, perhaps, in ourselves and in our present condition, it should rebuke us, make us more humble, and help us to look for a more sound basis for that pride, which might be to start examining these claims in the light of common sense, in the light of the other scientific evidence that suggests that there are things going on in nature, some of which we understand and some of which we don't, far more powerful in their impact on our environment and our conditions than anything we are capable of contributing to the future. And that, I think, would allow us to escape the machinations of all of these folks who are exploiting these new forms of superstition in order to gain greater power over us for themselves.
I think you've hit the key, and we'll go to the chief here in a second, but think of this, folks. If we talk about, is that magic real or not, we can have discussions. But if you understand that it isn't about whether the magic is real or not, but whether the guy who's the magician can get close to the kids so he can molest them. I think global warming has nothing to do with warming or global or weather. It's just a way that they can find some palatable reason to separate us from our money and our freedom. That's all that it was, that's all that it is, and that's all that it will be. Chief?
I want to make a comment that's going to come back to what Dr. Keyes said, I hope. But first of all, if there is or if there is not global warming, human beings have nothing to do with it. We cannot control it. It's been measured before. One volcanic eruption creates thousands and thousands of more pollutants into the air than any nuclear bomb we've ever exploded. So nature does its own polluting, and nature takes care of it on its own. Oil, for example, when there's an oil spill, where did oil come from? Oil came from the ground. You know, when it leaked into the Gulf, well, everybody was saying, oh, how awful it is. Well, guess what? It disappeared because nature takes care of that. That's where it came from. But Dr. Keyes mentioned superstition of the past, and I was immediately thinking about Bill Gates and what's his company name? Microsoft. Right now they're being just manhandled by the government left and right because they're using that same analogy that he used with the superstition and the voodoo priest of the past, who by superstition gets people to give up their goods and give up their money and their freedom. Well, now the government's using not only superstition but power, and the power of the government and the IRS to do that as well. But this idiotic representative, is it White House or
Sheldon Whitehouse.
Mr. Whitehouse, who is blaming the red states for all this, seem to have forgotten about China and Japan and South America and South Africa and the rest of the world that may also be putting out pollutants as well, which whether they are or not has nothing to do with global warming.
All right, we're going to again shift because I'm trying to cover a lot of topics. It just came out a few hours ago, maybe 6 hours ago or thereabouts, that this lady from the IRS, the one who was the head of the who gets tax exempt, and now is going to be the head of who gets what health insurance and the whole enforcement arm with 16,000 new IRS people. She's been called before Congress and she's let them know she's going to take the fifth. That's her right. We still have that right until they find a way to take that one away, I suppose. But what it has done is done a major graffiti. Ready? Obama administration, liars, thieves, disingenuous, dishonest, not that we didn't all know that, but some on the left didn't, and maybe what they call low information voters didn't. So now this lady, who was the top person, who came out and made the quote-unquote apology with a staged question, hoping to sneak it under the radar, knowing it was going to come out anyway because there was a whistleblower, now she's going to take the fifth. I'll start with you, Chief. What do you think that's going to do, and what do you think that means?
Well, first of all, the hypocrisy to me just is a slap in the face for every American. Here you have a woman who's part of a regime that has done everything they can to take away our Second Amendment rights under the Constitution, and now we've seen how they're trying to take away our First Amendment rights under the Constitution, and also
don't get the fourth, self-incrimination with the IRS.
Tax us into oblivion with these illegal mechanisms to not allow people to represent themselves with their freedom of speech by donating money, and also using that tax code against law-abiding people. Now, that same person, that same part of that regime is going to demand their constitutional right under the Fifth Amendment. It's just hypocritical, but it proves and shows that they're liars, cheats, and thieves.
Dr. Keyes.
Instead, I have to confess, I find it particularly ironic that this lady who was in charge of the IRS would be invoking her Fifth Amendment rights. I've often tried to get folks to just focus on this simple fact. Every year, by April 15th, they tell us we are required by law to sign an affidavit, that is to testify, in answer to the following question. How much income did you make last year from all sources, right? Isn't that the question we're answering on the 1040 form? I think it is. Now, let's see. The government is asking us how much income we made and saying that we are compelled by law to answer the question on this form.
On penalties of perjury.
And yet, yet there is that little line that this lady has apparently read that basically says that you cannot be compelled to give evidence against yourself. So if it can be used or is going to be used in any way against you in any kind of criminal prosecution of any kind, then you can't be forced to do that. They can't force you to provide evidence against yourself. She seems to know that that's the case. Interesting though, Stan. Can you explain to me why it is that when she was over at the IRS, I don't recall that they are required to tell you that you have the right to remain silent. All the crooks get the right to remain silent if they're arrested. Innocent people who are guilty of no offense except making a living apparently don't have the right to take the fifth because they're being compelled by law to provide this testimony about what they made last year. Now, if you think that through, Stan, you understand that the whole premise on which the administration of the income tax is presently based is contrary to the Constitution. And I would say that if this lady who was abusing the IRS's power for partisan reasons or tolerating such abuses on her watch can stand behind the Fifth Amendment, how come every other person in America can't stand behind the Fifth Amendment, can't take the Fifth Amendment when the government demands to take from them by force information that the Constitution says they cannot be compelled to provide? When are Americans going to wake up? I really wonder how long people are going to remain this dense. It's like this lady is mocking us. She is taking the very right against self-incrimination that has been guaranteed to all of us by the Constitution and hiding her abuses behind her invocation of that right, knowing full well that her responsibility over at the IRS was to make sure that right was suspended for every American citizen every year when they were compelled to turn in this 1040 that on the face of it violates that same provision of the Constitution. I just keep asking myself, why are Americans putting up with this one? And I think the answer is in the IRS abuses themselves. If you can isolate people, if you can take them down one at a time, and they feel all isolated, alone, and under the thumb of a bureaucracy that seems to have no constitutional constraints, then you have put a fear in them that leads them to surrender their rights. And that's why I think these abuses are so dangerous to our whole way of life, and that if the GOP and others try to follow Rush Limbaugh's faulty reasoning and pretend that they should not use the impeachment power to get the information the public needs to make up its mind about these abuses, then I think our days as a free people are strictly numbered. We have come to the end game here. And right now, we don't have anybody on the scene who understands that and is willing to play capably and competently on behalf of the people of this country.
Well, let me just say quickly to all of our representatives, this is exactly like the story of the Frankenstein monster. It was built in the laboratory, it busted out, it's terrorizing the city, no one could put it back in the laboratory. The only way to kill the IRS, the only way to stop the IRS is to kill it. We need to abolish the IRS right now.
Well said. Now, let me quote someone that everyone's heard of. His name is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin somehow knew Dr. Keyes, I'm sure, but Benjamin Franklin said, if we don't hang together, we'll all hang separately. That's exactly, in my opinion, what Alan is saying. If we don't, all of us, Republicans, Democrats, independents, rich, poor, black, red, brown, white, if we don't understand, if we don't stand up and say, hell no, to a government that doesn't have to play by the rules, when they're demanding that we play by the rules, then we're going to give up on there being any rules to follow, and it's just do what you're told. Am I close, Alan?
I just had a funny thought. What if all throughout the country, when the next kind of tax business rolls around, what if all throughout the country, everybody simply took the 1040 form and wrote at the top of it, I refuse to answer this question on the grounds that it might tend to incriminate me, and sent it back. and if anybody asked, they could say, well, I'm just following the example of that former IRS head.
We can call it the Lois Lerner syndrome. I love it. That's a brilliant idea. All right. I want to talk now, because we only have a few minutes left, about Benghazi. Many people do not know that Raymond Maxwell was fired for what happened in Benghazi. He is a career State Department bureau chief of Near Eastern Affairs. One small problem. He wasn't involved, had no knowledge of it before, during, or after, other than maybe what he read in the papers. He had nothing to do with it. But they fired him because they needed someone to fire. Guess what he's going to do? He's going to testify. He's going to state what he knows and say, well, you're going to fire me. I sure can't lose my career. I may as well serve the American people by giving what information. And people don't understand that the whole AP thing, the whole Attack Fox thing, the whole God knows what we don't know about yet thing, is all about this administration using their Chicago training, saying, if you mess with us, we'll kill you. And so if you speak out of turn, out of school, we'll find out who you are no matter what we have to do, legal, illegal, moral, immoral, ethical, unethical, and we'll find you and we'll deal with you. We are dealing with low-level street mafioso thugs, only they happen to be president, attorney general, head of Homeland Security, and a few other positions. Oh, vice president in charge of lobotomies. Chief.
Well, first of all, there's a difference between leaks and people that are trying to expose corruption. And so it is the duty of the government and law enforcement to stop leaks. Like, for example, let's say that someone in the government and a reporter are colluding together to leak classified materials to a foreign country. That is a crime and should be stopped. And the White House and the FBI and everyone else should be working to stop that. But if there's corruption in the government and a government worker is trying to relay information to the news media that corruption is taking place, that's a whistleblower and a First Amendment protected reporter gaining that information. But what the White House is doing is they're not focusing on those real leaks, the dangerous leaks at all. They're only focusing on people that are leaking, blowing the whistle on them, and the reporters that are trying to access that information. It's totally unconstitutional, it's illegal, and that's where the White House is right now, in the middle of this corruption and illegal activity.
Dr. Keyes.
Well, Stan, I think the chief is exactly right, and the way that he has described it is an appropriate reminder of why the provision for impeachment exists in the Constitution. And before I say this, I hope everybody understands two things. First of all, impeachment is not limited to the president and vice president. The impeachment provision applies to the president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the government of the United States. That means that this lady who's sitting in there saying she's taking a fifth and all of this, she is subject to impeachment. The second thing is, impeachment does not involve removal. When Rush Limbaugh and others talk as if impeachment and removal are the same thing, this is wrong. It's not the case in the Constitution. They're not only not the same thing in terms of their immediate result, they were not intended to be of the same high level of seriousness and infrequency, let's say. You know how I know that? I know it because in order to impeach, which is to say accuse, draw up a regular list of the things that you think someone has done wrong based on a suitable investigation into their behavior. In order to do that, the House of Representatives needs to act by a bare majority, a simple majority. 50% plus one, right? One vote. Half plus one. That's it. That's all it takes. In the Senate, it's a 2/3 vote, much higher threshold. What does that tell you? It tells you that the folks who wrote the Constitution thought impeachments would be not routine, but frequent, fairly frequent, because they required no more of a majority than is required to pass a regular bill. And they thought that removal would be harder and therefore less frequent. Why do you think they did that? Does that make sense to you? Makes sense to me. Do you know why? Because if you're to hold people accountable, you need to be able to call them to account whenever their action appears to cross the line of constitutional propriety. It's not going to be the case that in every instance you're sure they have crossed that line. It might just look like they have. But you want to be able to force them to come before you and give an account. And guess what? You've heard of famous stories about executive privilege and how the president doesn't have to send this one or that one over to the House to testify and all of this because he can extend the cloak of executive privilege. Executive privilege is ultimately rooted in the pardoning power. Because if they say no and somebody else wants to try to pretend that they're breaking some law or something, the president can just say, forget it, I pardon them, and I'm going to protect them. So his ability is very real in terms of that pardoning power in the Constitution. But what limits the pardoning power? Well, I'll tell you, the pardoning power applies. The president can extend that protection, which then is the ground or basis of executive privilege, in all cases except impeachment. Did you hear me? In all cases except impeachment. Where impeachment is concerned, there is no pardoning power. There is no basis for the invocation of so-called executive privilege. He must respond, or that is an additional offense against the Constitution. Now, what's the purpose? What would be the purpose of having an impeachment if you knew that the Senate was under the control of the other party or advocates of the president who weren't going to let him be removed, or of any official, and they weren't going to let him be removed? I'll tell you what the founders intended. They thought that you would impeach them, and if the Senate didn't remove them, that failure to respond to breaches of the Constitution would then become the key basis for going to the people at the next election and saying, we must get control of the Senate. You must kick out those who refuse to let this person be punished and removed, rather, so that they could stand trial for their crimes. Because you understand that you can't try somebody that the president is protecting for a given infraction until you have impeached and removed the president. You can't try the president, you can't try the civil officials until you have removed them from that protection which establishes the boundary between the executive branch and the legislature. But the legislature's in charge of that. If they have a sufficient will to impeach, accuse, and then take the information developed by that impeachment process to the people so that they can remove those voting obstacles in the Senate, and so that the proper interests of the country can be protected. That's why Hamilton, by the way, called the impeachment process political. He didn't mean it in the sense of partisan and all this junk these people talk about. He meant it in the sense that the vital interest of the whole people is at stake. And therefore, in the end, it will be up to the whole people at the polls to decide whether or not that individual should be removed. That's what I think they expected. So impeachment isn't about removing. It's about making sure the information is gathered and the public is informed so that at the polls they can then make an informed judgment in order to remove from office those who are abusing their public trust.
On that note, we're going to call it an evening. We have a minute left. Let me just, I can't really quote, but talk about what we have heard throughout history. There is a time for thought. There is a time for action. Now is a time for action. Not necessarily military, that's not what I'm talking about. There's a time to stand up, to shout out, to demonstrate, to flood with calls to civil disobedience, like was suggested by Dr. Keyes, of taking the fifth on your 1040. If it's done by 3, they'll cook you. If it's done by 30, they'll fry you. If it's done by 3,000, they'll think about it. If it's done by 300,000, they'll be in a quandary. If it's done by 3 million, we win. Game's over. Hello. Hello. We have more than that will watch this show over the next 30 days. Just some thoughts. Dr. Keyes, thank you so much.
Good to be with
Steve,
you.
Always our honor, and you're the greatest honor. Those of you who watch what we do, let me tell you something. Dr. Keyes doesn't get paid a quarter. Chief Steve doesn't get paid a quarter. I don't have a quarter. But the reality is we all love this country. Good night, America.
Thank you.